Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international relations, produced under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative of the International Studies Association and made available through the ISA Professional Resource Center. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. The episodes of The Teaching Curve are conversations with thoughtful and innovative teachers of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by tapping into the energy that animates successful teachers. Inevitably, this is more than just a duty to do a good job or even to serve students. The energy that animates successful teachers is a joy that comes from empowering others by facilitating environments in which students tap into their own agency to create projects that have meaning and purpose in a deeply personal way. Today's conversation is with Kate Schick and Claire Timperley. Kate and Claire teach at Te Herenga Waka, also known as Victoria University in Wellington, in Aotearoa, the country most of us call New Zealand. They are also the editors of a new volume from Routledge entitled Subversive Pedagogies, Radical Possibility in the Academy. Our conversation covers emotional and life-affirming rewards that can be found in investing in the practices of good teaching, approaches to the profession that create synergies between academic responsibilities that are normally considered separate and distinct obligations, and how pedagogical choices can subvert the constraints of the neoliberal colonial university for the benefit of students, instructors, and society at large. So, Kate Schick and Claire Timperley, welcome to the Teaching Curve podcast. So glad we could get this going across so many time zones. I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
The first question I always ask is about the people who make us teachers, and that's our students. So can you tell me a little bit about the students at Te Herenga Waka University, which is also known as Victoria University in Wellington?
That's right. Yeah, so we have a really diverse range of students. We have about 20,000 students from across Aotearoa New Zealand and also international students from over 100 countries. About 12% of our students are Māori, so they're the Indigenous people of Aotearoa New Zealand. About 6% are Pacifica. Most of our students work, some of them quite long hours, battling high cost of living, wages that aren't keeping pace with inflation. An increasing number face housing insecurity, and a number of them also have struggles with mental health. There's a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and we have a number of first generation students.
And we're one of the 8 public universities in New Zealand, or in fact, all of the universities in New Zealand are public universities. So they draw from across the country and really are kind of representative of all of the people across the country. It's sort of assumed that if you want to attend university, you should be able to, assuming you complete your final year of high school.
It must create diverse classrooms in those ranges of people that sometimes make it difficult to teach, huh?
It does. Yeah, it makes a big difference also whether you're teaching first year students or third year students. By third year, they often have a better sense of the institution and how it works and some of the constraints and the power dynamics, which we talk about a little bit in the book. But in the first year, there's an awful lot of trying to reveal the hidden curriculum, trying to get students, some students just naturally fall into it, either because of their high school or their parents' experiences. But for many, we actually have to do quite a lot of work just kind of bringing them into this institution, which, I mean, again, we talk about a bit in the book, is sort of neoliberal and colonial and has a whole set of assumptions and rules that aren't always clear to students.
And that's what you mean by the hidden curriculum. I think that's a term that some people may not be familiar with, but that's a powerful thing. Tell me about that. So
it really is. So this hidden curriculum is all the assumptions built into a university education that, especially if you yourself have had an university education, which most people who are teaching at universities have, you just assume that everybody knows how it works. So you assume that people know what a lecture is. You assume they know how to take notes for a lecture. You assume they even know kind of how to navigate around the place and where the library is and what a library does. I've had students come to my office and I've given them recommendations for books and they don't even know what a call number is. They don't know how to find that book in the library. So especially at the first year, there's a lot of work just sort of making sure that stuff, which is often an obstacle to students learning, but really doesn't need to be if we're just really clear about some of the kind of the basic logic of how the institution works.
That's great. I mean, it's such an important thing in how you think about what authorizes you to be in front of the classroom, right? I mean, in many ways, the three little letters after our names are things that say we know the content, right? But we're also so used to being students that we forget that we're also very good at studentness, at being students.
Very true. Yeah, even things like managing time, right? So I always do a session with my students about, okay, so you have a 3,000 or a 7,000 or however long the essay is, word essay to write. Let's sit down and think about how you're going to carve out time to plan and do your research and to write that. And are you going to do all your research before you start writing? Or like, how are we going to do this? And so orienting your student to the art of writing an essay, even in terms of like how much time per day between now and the due date. So, I do that quite explicitly with my students, and I share with them my own writing journeys and how I carve out time, and going through those kind of maybe quite basic things. I think students really appreciate it.
And so that personal quality of teaching is something that those of us lucky enough to find it really fulfilling, I think. But there's also what the institution asks you to do. And so how do you make sense of that difference between what the university asks you to do and what you choose to do as a teacher investing in these ways?
Well, I think, again, this is something that it's taken time to, and I suspect will continue to take time to develop. I mentioned in the book that I was recently treated for breast cancer, and that's definitely been helpful for me in terms of reordering my priorities. COVID, I think, has actually played a similar role for many people. What actually matters about this life that we have and what we can do in it. And for me, recognizing that I care deeply about other people, and especially about students or people who are more vulnerable than me or in precarious positions. I care a lot about, we know that within academia, that's becoming more and more rampant. And so for me, it's just being really clear about what are my values and how do I align those with the demands of my job. We're quite lucky that the university does place value on teaching as its own enterprise. So we're not feeling like we're having to constantly do teaching in the margins. But for me, I'm happy to devote perhaps more time than others would to teaching, because for me, that's just really important to me for some of the reasons we've mentioned here and a whole host of other reasons. But in terms of how to manage what the institution demands of me, I think I've done an awful lot of thinking about, what does my job require of me, but also what is really important and how can I make those two things align as best as possible. I don't always get it right, but I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. Okay.
Yeah, I think, and it's a very similar story for me. I think obviously the university has particular demands, and you need to make sure that you're meeting those demands, right? You're doing a job. But I do try to think, as various options are presented to me, what am I going to find most life-giving? So ensuring that the projects I take on are largely ones that kind of align with who I am and what my values are. And so teaching related things, for both of us. I think also our teaching is, fed into our research increasingly over time. And so that's been a really nice way of marrying our research and our teaching. The way I sometimes put it is that I enjoy all the different aspects of my job. Actually, I really love my job, but sometimes in aggregate, it feels like too much, and we have young families, and sometimes juggling it all is it can be challenging. So I think kind of maximizing the life giving as you kind of meet the kind of the necessary goals is important. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, of course, one of the things that then they throw you the curve, like a pandemic that says, and all of those patterns that you've developed, those aren't necessarily going to work anymore. So go figure out some new ones, by the way.
That's very true.
Just move your teaching online, or in the case of New Zealand, we want you to teach both online and in person simultaneously. But it's been so interesting to me just what this reveals about what the university thinks that we're doing in our classrooms as well, because it seemed to me, at least it could just be my experience, but of the university called it dual delivery, was very much an underlying assumption that I stand at the front of my lecture and I lecture at students. And so it's no extra effort for me just to push a record button. And then it's all presented in dual delivery, voila. And that's just not how I run my classroom like Kate. It's very interactive. I have them in groups. We do lots of I really like to get them moving around the room. And it becomes a very different enterprise trying to convert what I used to do into this dual delivery. But really speaks, I think, again, to that. I don't think this is even hidden curriculum. I think this is just an assumption that the university had about what teaching looks like.
Yeah, for sure. And if you did it right, you could just record the thing and then take vacation the next semester, right? Just run it again. Yeah.
They don't even need you anymore.
Now you're talking about neoliberal universities. So let's talk about the book, which is fantastic. And my first question is about the title. Why Subversive Pedagogies? What is it that teaching should be subverting?
So I think one of the reasons that we called the book Subversive Pedagogies was because the thing that Claire was just talking about, that kind of dominant transmission model of education where there's the expert knower, the lecturer, the university lecturer, transmitting knowledge to the kind of receptive student. And I think it's a caricature, right? I don't think that's really the way that most people teach all the time, but I think it's recognizable for a reason. And so part of what we're trying to do is to kind of rethink our practices and sites of teaching, as well as the content. I think there's been a lot of attention to content and maybe less attention to the kind of the how, like what we're doing with our teaching, to challenge this dominant transmission, which is prevalent in the neoliberal colonial university.
That totally makes sense to me. What's the goal of the book?
I think we had a couple of kind of political and ethical projects in mind. I think we wanted to articulate kind of our concerns with the current model of education, or the dominant model of education. I think we also saw in our university that more and more, at least of the lecturers that we were in contact with, were doing some phenomenal kind of challenging of the dominant model. And so we could see that there was a lot of work on the ground that wasn't necessarily being shared more broadly. We also saw a lot of things happening outside of the university, which were very exciting to us, and we thought should be considered pedagogy in a way that, again, the way that we discipline both kind of within the discipline and between disciplines. Sometimes we don't see those things because we can't fit them neatly into their little disciplinary boundaries. So I think, some of the things we wanted to do were kind of, we wanted to offer some kind of some theory to kind of both identify some of the problems, but also to think about alternatives. So we do a bit of work in our introduction, thinking about relational and embodied pedagogies. as alternatives to this kind of transmission model. But we also wanted to offer some really, and a number of the contributors also offer some really thoughtful kind of theoretical contributions to how can we understand pedagogy? What is it to teach? Or even, is teaching impossible, is sort of the central premise of one of the chapters. But then I think we also wanted to offer some kind of practical examples of what does some, whether you want to call it subversive pedagogy or alternative pedagogy, look like. So there are a couple of chapters which offer concrete examples of what are some ways that you can think about pedagogy and how might you use that, whether it's in your classroom or outside your classroom or kind of in the community.
And I mean, I think partly we wanted to learn from these contributors, right? We sat down, actually we were on a retreat, and we sat down and kind of made a wish list of a bunch of people, just for starters, that we thought were doing really interesting and exciting things and that we wanted to learn from, and that we thought that woven together would make for an exciting volume with different voices and different ways of engaging with students and the public as well. So that was our kind of starting point, was, oh, this is exciting. We kind of came up with a title and then thought, right, how are we going to make this?
Yeah,
how are we going to make this work?
And I think very successfully done, by the way, with your goals. But I mean, I think that if we're talking to people who are not yet convinced, they're going to say, well, that sounds hard. That sounds like you're making my teaching harder. What do you say to that? How are you going to convince them that it's worth investing themselves to do this like you all have?
Well, one of the things that I boast about to my colleagues is what an absolute delight it is to mark for these courses.
Yes, that is very true.
So some of the things that I do are I offer assessment options. So rarely do I tell students you must do X, Y, and Z. I have a few different options that they can choose from. So I've had students, they have produced waiata, traditional Māori songs. They've given me these beautiful, I had one student do essentially an embroidery exhibition where she made a number of pieces of embroidery. I had one student who worked at a cafe in town. She convinced the owner of the cafe to let her take over the cafe and turn it into a temporary art gallery one evening. And so she had filled this cafe with her artwork. This was for a feminist theory course. And she'd invited all her friends. I took along my 4-year-old at the time, and he was sort of gazing around at all of it. So, I mean, the marking is just, it's not work. It's just an utter delight to be engaging with these students, and they're so enthusiastic and novel and innovative. And so if you're converting, I mean, any conversion of a course into something else is going to be work. So I'm not trying to suggest there's not work involved, but once you've got it, for me, it's a real joy, especially, the marking, which often is a bit burdensome or can be if it's just essay after essay after essay. But then, more generally, just students' responses to the course, it's just, so fulfilling. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think we get to know our students a lot better, right? So one of the things that I've started doing, I've also recently started doing the creative option, because I sort of borrowed it from Claire and actually and from another colleague, Greta Snyder, who's at Williams. And I've watched them have this creative option, and it's been such a joy. It's been a lovely, that's been really wonderful. And I also get my students to write self-reflection essays at the end of the course. And, it's amazing that you really hear from students, and you hear the way that they've engaged with the material, and very often they're reflecting on their lives, and they're integrating the two, and that's very exciting. And and often moving, and so I think it increases the joy quotient.
Oh, for sure. And I would say, if I'm trying to diagnose why that works, I would say what you're doing is authorizing the agency of the students as creative people, which is of course what education should all be about. But in the model that you're talking about, for where it's been and where it's seen, it's not about creativity. It's about just remembering, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you say you get to choose how you do your assignments, or the creativity in this is an expression of what we're building for the reason for the course.
Yeah.
All of that seems like when they're turning on their own light bulbs, as opposed to you kind of screwing something in and flipping them.
Yeah.
They're doing it.
Yeah, that's right.
And the effort they put in is far greater than they would for a rote assessment. They're doing it, and I'm positively encourage them to work together on things. So I've had some students, they've created board games together, and just in the construction of the game and thinking about the rules and thinking about what they want to include, they're having these discussions about New Zealand politics or feminist theory or whatever it is that I'm teaching, that I could only dream of them sitting and having. That's kind of on their time. They're
Right.
choosing to do that.
Right.
And that's just brilliant.
And they're talking with flatmates and friends and parents and grandparents, and you know, I had one student who was weaving for the first time, and she was learning from her grandmother and aunties, and there was you know, a lot of banter, and it was also a way of her, so it was a way of her learning a traditional skill, but also of building that relationship as well, and all the while as she was kind of engaging with the material. So yeah, I think another student took his painting on holiday with him, and so, you know, and he was, you know, talking about this with his friends as they were, you know, on holiday. And yeah, so I think it's more likely to seep into their everyday lives and everyday relationships as well. I think when you're inviting this kind of engagement, it's not just in the classroom and in the library.
Quite early on, I was very lucky when I was at graduate school. I was able to, I went to the University of Virginia, and they had this fantastic course design institute. And one of the things they introduced us to was backwards course design, which is motivated by the question, what do you wish your students remembered from this course in 5 years' time? And that's been hugely influential for me in terms of thinking about what are the experiences. Like the content is obviously important. That's kind of the foundation of what the course is designed around. But at the end of the day, it's how they engage with that and what they're going to remember really shifts how you view, or for me, how I viewed what I was trying to do with a course. And so, yeah, these students who do these creative projects, I'm pretty confident that in 5 years' time, they will remember what they did and hopefully some of the content along with that. Whereas if I ask them to do a standard essay, for some of them they will, because that's really how they want to engage. But for many, it's just something that's a requirement, check the box, get the grade and move on, and forgotten in probably 2 weeks.
No, I think that's fair. I think this is an example of an approach to students as real in control, as owners of this process that you're asking them to do, as opposed to doing it for you. They're doing it for themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's how you build people to invest and engage in what they're up to. They're doing it for themselves, and they understand it. They can link task to mission, to task to project to mission, and it makes sense to them. So. Well, Kate and Claire, this has been fantastic. What a great conversation. I really enjoyed your energy together. I can understand how the project worked and how you were able to pull that off together. And just the conversations that I know that went into all of that stuff just comes spilling out as a collaborative relationship that I know you value, and I hope you continue to do it, because not everybody finds that. And that's a very powerful piece of the creative energies that go into not just the teaching, but the telling us about your teaching and other people's stuff. We're benefiting from it. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us. Yeah. This has been a really enjoyable conversation.
For those interested in joining the larger disciplinary conversation about pedagogy, don't forget to register today for ISA's Innovative Pedagogy Conference, to be held Tuesday, March 29th in Nashville, Tennessee. There's so much conferencing we need to get back to. The Teaching Curve podcast is made available through the ISA Professional Resource Center. under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org and follow us on Twitter @teachingcurve. Thanks for joining us again on the Teaching Curve. And remember, learn something every time you teach.